I did not become a human rights lawyer to go work for Google. Children who are being bought and sold, especially in the US, Craigslist at the time was being used as a platform to sell girls. Tech has been a powerful disruptor of that silence and isolation. When you're a human rights lawyer, you get trained in the importance of documenting the abuse. And why do you document the abuse? You document the abuse so that the world may bear witness.
Hello, and welcome to AI with GenAI. I'm your host, Jen Gennai, former founder of Google's Responsible Innovation team and current head of Responsible AI at T3. Today, I'm honored to host Malika Saada Saar. Malika is a distinguished policy expert and human rights advocate at the forefront of technology governance and AI ethics. Currently serving as a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, she was previously Google's global head of human rights, leading strategic initiatives to ensure that human rights principles were integrated into products globally. And she architected strategic and transformative partnerships with UN Women and the UN High Commission for Refugees. Malika founded and served as executive director of the Human Rights Project for Girls and was named among 150 women shake the world by Newsweek and the Daily Beast, among many other honors and awards. She served as the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS during the Obama administration and currently sits on the board of directors for the Peabody and the board of governors for Brown University's Watson Institute. Malika, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's such an honor.
So I ran through only a small part of your very impressive bio. I love working with you. I love watching your videos and how much you've really informed and had such a strategic impact on not just technology, but law, human rights, how we think about these things, and now especially your impact on students and the next generation. We really need more people thinking more deeply about the human impacts of our technologies. But tell us more what's behind that bio. What brought you to this type of essentially human-centered need to ensure that these technologies have a positive impact on the world? Tell us more.
Sure. I always joke that I did not become a human rights lawyer to go work for Google. I became a human rights lawyer really in the tradition of Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston. I went to law school because I believed that law could help us bend towards goodness and justice. And I was going to do civil rights law, but I felt like civil rights law had really been hollowed out. And I was drawn to human rights law because human rights law really talks about the inherent power and dignity of the individual. It's not about the way that a state gives the individual power or a piece of paper accrues rights and dignity to the individual. But by virtue of being human, we are of inherent rights and dignity. And I was drawn to that. And I was drawn to how human rights law allows us to be intersectional in the way that we think about identities and our rights, not just political rights, but cultural rights, not just the identity of being female, but of color or sexuality. And so I went in that direction and did the work of human rights, really focus on gender-based violence, looking at issues of the ways in which to be female was to be inevitably subject to violence, and the way that gender violence was borderless. And I also focused a lot on how child trafficking was really the razor's edge of gender-based violence. And that work of gender-based violence and child sex trafficking brought me to tech because so many of the children who are being bought and sold, especially in the US, were being bought and sold online. I had one of the survivors of child sex trafficking explain to me Craigslist at the time was being used as a platform to sell girls. Yeah. So it was that work that brought me into the space of tech and went into Google, really thinking about how is it that we can ensure that a platform like Google could be a good actor in this space. but I was really part of a generation of human rights lawyers who were being brought into tech to help figure out how do we take these frameworks around individual rights and democratic values and apply them to tech policy and to product design. And it was a really wonderful place to be in, to be able to say that we have this approach of thinking about the dignity of the individual, of thinking about these international norms around our rights and applying that to how we think these tech companies ought to move forward in both their tech policy as well as their product design.
That resonates so strongly about even these horrific things that are happening offline. People may think that they're either happening in the shadows or there's no exposure to what we may all interact with every day. And that's not true. How these global technology platforms facilitate some of the worst abuses that we can see happening across the globe, even if they're unseen to many people, and the role and responsibilities of these large tech companies to ensure that their platforms not only are not being used for abuses, but how can they use to help? So with that, leading into our first question of the T3 trio, are there ways that you see AI or advanced technologies being able to help in the space of human rights, or where are you seeing them making things worse? Tell us a bit about how the technology facilitates or prevents some of these issues that you're raising.
Yes, and let me take one step back in answering that question, which is even before AI, part of why I believed I had a role in tech was because when you're a human rights lawyer, you get trained in the importance of documenting the abuse. And why do you document the abuse? You document the abuse so that the world may bear witness. And when we think about human rights abuses, we know that what protects the abuse is silence and isolation. Tech has been a powerful disruptor of that silence and isolation. So if you just think about most recently George Floyd and the courage of Darnella Frazier to take out her phone, which has a human rights tool, to take that phone and capture the murder of George Floyd so that the world could bear witness to this abuse of human rights. It is such a powerful example of how technology allows us to harness these global platforms, these tools of human rights like phones that were never started as such, and be able to ensure that there is this opportunity for global witnessing of abuse. Now, I believe in that very deeply. We also understand the ways in which these technologies can be weaponized against us to deny our human rights. But it is important to be able to see what I call a through line from the courage of Mamie Till, who said that I will make sure to open my son's coffin so that the world may bear witness to the murder of my son, Emmett Till, and the horror of racial terror, to what Darnella Frazier did with her phone, the technology that it provided, and the global platforms of a YouTube, of an Instagram to be able to bear witness. In the context of AI, I think we're in the same place of the duality of tech. There is a way in which AI allows us to be able to think through new ways of bearing witness, new ways of thinking about the application of human rights laws and human rights guardrails to do responsible AI governance. There is a way that NGOs can think about this technology to surmount educational inequities. There's a way that this technology can be used around access to healthcare that would be otherwise denied to rural communities, to communities in underdeveloped parts of our world. And at the same time, this is a technology that is rooted in bias, and the ways in which this technology risks reifying, reproducing these ways of thinking that are about continuing racialized and gendered hierarchies that belong to an older way of how we should interact in the world. The
Mhm.
same way that there is the opportunity to move us forward through AI, there are so many risks around perpetuating a caste system that is race-based and gender-based. And so I think we're really at that place of how do we make sure that AI is a technology that doesn't reify bias, that doesn't reify discrimination? How is it that it can be a technology that is truly of the 21st century, that is not trapped in the thinking and the behaviors of the 20th century and those ways of thinking before that had been so steeped in colonization and enslavement?
I love your point about this is a 21st century technology. So how do we ensure it aligns with 21st century culture, status, systems that we want to build? What is the future that we're building? Not how are we reproducing, as you say, reifying of the past, that we can be better, but it doesn't just happen. We have to take deliberate steps. And I love your wording of the bearing witness, that tying that thread across history, actually across very horrific instances in history, but allowing the world to see and have to confront that this is happening and being able to share that and hope that these technologies can drive to a more equal, just world that we have. So, what are the regulatory challenges or industry processes or otherwise that are stopping us from achieving the positive parts of AI? Are there any regulatory or company changes that you'd need to see?
Yeah. So, before we were in the AI arms race, there was a lot of conversation around what is the ethical use and governance of AI? What is responsible and safe AI? And I think that even during those good years when there was an investment in the responsible and safe use of AI and the language of ethics were center, even then, human rights was not foundational to those conversations. We didn't talk about having human rights as the core, as foundational to how we do AI design, deployment, and governance. And I think it was dangerous because what was failed to be reckoned with is how, when we look at human rights, it's not some radical approach. Human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, came out of the ashes of World War II. That because we had to recognize that there are powers in the world that would take their citizens and put their citizens into oven, there had to be an approach to protecting the rights of the individual. That's what the UN Declaration of Human Rights came out of in terms of ethos and history. We have had over 75 years to build these international norms, these agreed upon approaches at global scale to ethics and rights of individuals, to conversations of what is the responsibility of the state to protect the individual, what is the responsibility of the corporation to be rights adherent. And it saddens me that all of that has been put aside in the way that we developed these conversations around AI governance, that we talked about ethics, but not this established human rights, which, human rights isn't about being Democratic or Republican. It's not about progressive or conservative. It is about agreed upon global norms that have had over 75 years of jurisprudence. So I think that was a real missed opportunity. And we are even further away from a conversation around human rights as foundational to AI governance and design now than we were even 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I think there is, though, some opportunities. I have a lot of hope in the EU AI Act, which does put human rights as part of its languaging and regulatory expectations, the importance of having individual rights assessments that AI companies are expected to do. I think that a lot of the language and focus of the EU around AI governance has sought to center human rights more. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens around implementation. And I have a hope that as we move more into the reality of AI reshaping how we understand ourselves and what it is even to be human, that our foundations that support our NGOs will also put a lot of investment in creating spaces where not only is civil society equipped to identify the harms of AI to rights and dignity, but also the opportunities.
Mhm.
I think often when you look at human rights work, we're very harm-based, right? We look at the idea of where's the harm? How do we then do mitigation of harm? How do we do remediation? And that harm-based approach is critical, and it's very critical around AI. And it's important that we also be at the forefront of thinking about how do we harness this technology to advance our human rights, to seek out our dignity and liberation.
Mhm.
We are not thinking about that part of the discourse with AI. We are not thinking about that part of how to use AI for us in the search for equity and dignity and rights and democratic values. Then we see the technology to the abusers, to the dictators, to the oligarchs. And
Mhm.
I don't think we can afford to do that. So I think we're at a very critical place of really thinking about how can civil society have the investment and the opportunity to continue work around harm, as well as to really think through how this technology belongs to us as well.
So much of what you said there both resonates with me personally, but also I think for people listening who have to tackle this in companies, that this reflection and capture of human rights in places like the EU AI Act is massively important. It gives a practical step by step, essentially guidelines of how to adopt this thinking. You may not be a human rights expert or lawyer. It's telling you this is what's expected. Conduct the impact analysis, assess those harms. And I think it is allowing it to maybe be a bit more accessible to people and hopefully bring more people along that journey. But in the spirit of this is like real talk, and I do think humility and transparency is important, I'll raise my hand and say, when I was starting off in my responsible AI development journey at Google, human rights was part of what I developed as the AI principles, and we noted it there. But I have to admit that it wasn't where I started when I was building the governance. I started from ethics. I started from this other way of thinking and had to have experts like you. And I remember Alex Walden educate me on the importance of leveraging something that's 75 years old, that has years of hard work and deep thinking around it to make it accessible and practical. And that certainly changed my approach. And it's now the approach that I continue to use. But I have to raise my hand and say, no, it wasn't where I started. It wasn't maybe obvious to me that we already had part of the solution. It's not this solution alone, but it was part of the solution that I was missing. And I think being able to see that now reflected, again, it's in the EU Act, it's in other places. I hope and I am optimistic that it's helpful to bring more of that thinking into governance day to day. But just to say, just certainly to admit that it was a miss on my part. And I think you're saying that it has been missed more broadly in that. And we are all parts of those systems. And I was part of that system too. So really think it's an important point to raise.
It is, and it's also an opportunity to recognize that when a company like Google decided to bring human rights lawyers in, the difference that it made, right? Because it was an opportunity for you to talk to me or to talk to Alex and understand that human rights framework and its relevancy. The same thing is true of other tech companies who brought human rights lawyers in, not to do human rights washing, but really use the expertise of human rights lawyers in these critical questions around governance, around design. And I'm afraid that many of those companies need to be reminded of our importance again, that human rights lawyers need to be at the table because we offer something very valuable around that expertise of this jurisprudence, of these frameworks, of these laws that really have global credibility on history and relevance, especially with the technology that has so many deep implications for our own humanity.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. Like building on that back to your other point around human rights is not political. It's about justice. It's about many things that wherever you sit on a either political or cultural perspective, I'd even argue that these are things that we can agree are rights. That is the whole point of them, that if we are preventing those rights, then that is what we have to look out for. And there's a lot of agreement there of where, yeah, freedom to do things, not just prevention of things for protection purposes only. So I think tying that together allows us to address it more holistically and is necessary in these tech companies as well as policy.
And also for it not to be construed as a barrier to innovation and competitiveness. That actually, we have so many examples that when we innovate from a rights-based framework, we actually innovate brilliantly and actually are able to build products that serve all of us. And we can see that just in terms of what have been the artifacts, the products that we've created when we have innovated from a place of accessibility. And I think there has to be more of that languaging. So it's not seen that when you bring in rights-based ways of thinking, you prevent brilliant innovation and design. It actually goes hand in.
That's it. Again, I think I raised this in my last conversation that people think that because the work that I do in responsible AI, then it's all about stopping things and preventing things from happening. And I'm saying, no, there's so much promise of this technology to not just do great things in our day-to-day, but also to help us at a societal level. But I want those things. And I know that they're not just going to happen, that we have to take deliberate steps. A human rights lens, like ethics, these are all the things that help us get there. And I want to see them as augmenting opportunities, allowing more people to participate. And I think sometimes it does get lost in the doom and gloom conversations that people either assign to us or are the parts that get called out. And I think it's important to recognize the risks, but we don't do it for the sake of identifying risks and harms. We do it to lead to better outcomes, to lead to better futures that we can develop together. Yeah. So with that, I'm going to do a bit of our little change to get into our fun little section of the Gen AI lens, where we use generative AI to generate a question. So one question is going to be around the technology and how you think about it. And the other generated question is going to be a bit more personal. It'll get into your motivations and values. So for the first generated question, I have 3 generated ones here. 1, 2, or 3. What question are you feeling today? 1, 2, or 3?
Let's start with 2 in the middle.
Okay. This is AI value alignment. If you had to hard code just 3 moral principles, or maybe for you, human rights, into a hypothetical super intelligent AI, what would they be? And where could they break down and fail in your new AI future? So it's about value alignment. If you could only hard code in 3, what would you choose?
Wow. Okay. I would hard code non-discrimination. I would hard code privacy. And I would hard code freedom of expression with safeguards that disentangle freedom of expression from hate speech.
And where are they hardest to live up to? So if we were now 10 years down this future, your hard-coded super intelligent is working away, anti-discrimination, privacy, freedom of expression, disallowing hate speech. Where can it break? Because humans, like we're saying, these technologies will help us be less discriminatory, protect our privacy now, and allow us to freely express. Where can they not help us? Like humans interacting with technology will always be humans, do something wrong, whatever. So where do you see either one or all 3 of them breaking down? Where can AI not solve yet for us?
You always have to be iterative, right, about these types of technologies, especially when you have the abiding commitment to equality and non-discrimination and dignity. I think that there are the challenges now and the challenges 10 years from now of, are we clear that under-resourced languages are part of the contemplation of technology? Is there the ability to hold intersectional identity in the effort for non-discrimination and identification of hate? Is there the understanding of language nuances and cultural nuances, especially in the global South, to ensure that into non-discrimination is evenly distributed and encoded? Those are the challenges that we have now when we talk about a commitment to these technologies and non-discrimination and equality. And there's also what we face now and will face even more so in the future is in the datafication of our lives. How is privacy protected? What does that look like? And the risk of, someone has called it the slow violence that AI can do. Dr. Sue Ann Teo talked about this notion of the slow violence that can be done to human rights around AI's use and design, because what does even like freedom of speech mean in an ecosystem that is littered with misinformation and disinformation? What does the right to privacy look like in the over datafication of our lives that I think is inevitable in light of this technology?
I'm going to go off script here a bit and say I've heard discussions of emergence of a right, and I don't know to think about it if it's too simplified or not, that in the future, the right to engage with a human. So nowadays, even as you engage in customer support channels or otherwise, that you're caught in that chain of going through different buttons, or now there's so many chatbots, that the right to know and engage. And obviously, the EOI Act has said you need to disclose if generative AI is being used. But do you have any thoughts of that? Does that diminish the seriousness of the other rights we're talking about? But as we lead to this future of engaging so much more with technology, becoming more reliant on it, any thoughts on this right to engage with a human, a right to do that?
I mean, it is interesting that, this technology in many ways decenters what it is to be human. And so I do believe in the importance of creating language and thinking that centers our human against the backdrop of this technology. So I think we ought to have the right to know whether we are engaging with a human being or a chatbot. I think that goes to reliability of information. I think that also this new commitment that we have to demand of civil discourse across these different social platforms and technologies, that we cannot continue to have a race to the bottom around calcifying how we come to information and how we engage in conversations of information. I also think that it is an opportunity, as we are looking at what does it mean to be human, we think about these questions of our humanity and our dignity as this technology takes more shape. And again, not to see it as binary, really think through, especially because of how AI sharpens these conversations and these challenges, to really bring in the poets and the philosophers to help us really tether ourselves to these conversations around our humanity and dignity as we continue to design AI models.
Yeah. Okay, and I think that it's not the binary choice. It brings me back to my next generated question of how we think about these technologies, engage with them. So for the more personal and maybe motivational one, 2, or 3, what are you feeling now?
Let's go with one.
Okay. This question is on personal failure is the descriptor. So describe a time when a technology system you helped build or advocate for ended up causing unintended harm, and how did it change your approach to your work?
I had a really amazing experience working with VR in the context of, we wanted to use VR to tell the stories of children behind bars. And the thinking was that what's unique about VR technology is that it puts you in the experience. So you are not a third party. We really wanted to think about, how do you create empathy, connection, adjacency to the experience of being a child behind bars through the VR technology. And we worked with a group of adults who had been incarcerated as children. And there was a real disconnect between their stories and what the folks were creating with VR. And it felt really uncomfortable, to be honest with you. And the first artifact that we created did not feel like it was using the best of the technology or the best of the expertise of those helping us to shape the narrative. And it did feel like a failure. And the learning for me came out of how important it is when you are doing that kind of co-design with community, how the community really needs to understand the technology, not like in a cursory way, but play with the technology, experience the technology, understand what it can do and can't do. And then the folks who are the technologists also really need to understand the individuals with the expertise so that they are, first of all, humble in what they co-create with the community and understand the technology not through their particular expertise, but that they understand the technology through the voices and experiences of those who have been hurt and impacted.
Mhm.
That takes much more time. It's more intensive around resources and bandwidth, but that's the way you have to do co-creation. And I think an important lesson to hold on to as we think about this notion of co-creation in the context of AI and community. How are we really going to co-create and co-design with community in a way that truly respects the experiences of those that we want to work with?
A great example. I know you're framing it as a personal failure, but like my example earlier, it's about what we learn from those and what we take away and how we might adapt our approaches going forward. And so we can bring that to any future work or relationships, even being able to share that with other people so they don't have to essentially do the same mistakes or missteps that we've done previously as well. So that would lead then to our final section of, so what can people do if they're not human rights lawyers? They don't have your expertise. How can people day to day bring more of a human rights lens to their work, to their thinking? So maybe it's not just about if you're developing this technology, but how can we be more human rights conscious consumers? And is there a way to have that market pressure as well? So what can people do?
A great question. First of all, for those who are part of the industry, they can open the doors to folks with human rights expertise. They can understand the value added of individuals who bring this type of background and expertise into the room. I think there is a fear right now of bringing in folks with civil rights and human rights expertise, that we are in some way considered part of the taboo around DEI, that we will make going to market harder. So I think it's really important to put aside that hyperbole and that misinformation and think about the real value added to innovation, to relevancy, to user opportunities and adoption by bringing in folks with this type of civil rights and human rights expertise. The other piece is to also demystify what human rights is. I think there's like, when we say human rights, it feels like the goal and stated and, oh, we have to know all this stuff around law and frameworks and covenants. And human rights is really about the basic dignity to live a life that is full in a way that allows to realize her full potential, his full potential. It's not that esoteric. It is about the right to not feel discriminated against, the right to have your own sense of interior, of privacy, the right to be able to express your ideas without the state taking that, right not to be regulated, scrutinized, punished without due process by the power of your country, your government. It is about the right to your religion. It is about the right to assembly. These are the basic ways that we want to live so that we can feel that sense of freedom to be treated well, to express our ideas, and not to feel the choke of undue government authority. And that's the basic stuff. And so what does that mean in the translation of this technology? How do we make sure as everyday folks who have a basic sense of that idea of living out our full potential to ensure that these technologies are part of reinforcing that rather than denying?
Yeah. No, there's so much there. And I really appreciate that it's both systemically what needs to happen at a organizational level to bring in this expertise, but also the personal responsibility and recognition of we all deserve these rights, but we also play a role in ensuring that everyone gets to enjoy those rights, and how we develop, use this technology is critical in helping us get there. So I appreciate this balance and tension you've brought us through today of how advanced technologies, not just AI, can help provide rights, allow us to reinforce our rights, but if not careful, can reify issues that we've historically had. And we need to grab this opportunity of 21st technology being reflective of where we want to be now and in the future. So thank you, Malika, for all of these critical stories and points you've been able to share today. I've learned a lot. We're going to put a summary of some of the key points and notes that you've raised today in our show notes. So folks, if you like this, please do like and subscribe. We're going to have Malika's details in our YouTube notes and send you her way on LinkedIn, and you can find me there as well. So thank you all for listening. We know the technology that we build today is a technology in future we'll have tomorrow. So let's build it with human rights in mind. Thank you.